The red icons pulsed on the main screen of the Tactical Operations Center, swarming a single, static green marker like wolves surrounding a wounded stag. The icon, designated Trident 4, was lodged deep in a topographical nightmare of razorback ridges and granite teeth known as the Al-Qadir Range. With them was a high-value asset, wounded, bleeding out, and carrying information that could cripple an entire terror network. Their extraction window had slammed shut 30 minutes ago when a planned LZ became a hornet's nest of heavy machine gun fire. Now they were trapped. Colonel Marcus Thorne stood before the screen, arms crossed, his face a mask of grim calculus. A former F-16 pilot himself, he understood the geometry of air power better than anyone in the room. He saw not just a map, but a three-dimensional problem of fuel, ordnance, and unacceptable risk. The carrier group was a full 90 minutes out, their fighters uselessly far. The local drone assets, Reapers and Global Hawks, were being blinded by sophisticated Russian-made electronic warfare suites, their video feeds dissolving into pixelated snow. "Sir, our birds are on standby," a young captain offered, his voice tight with hope. Thorne didn't even turn. "Negative, Captain. The IADS in that valley is layered and mobile. We've got confirmed SA-15s and ZSU-23s. Sending in PAVE lows would be like sending lambs to a slaughter. The risk assessment is black. We cannot sanction a rescue operation with this threat profile." His voice was flat, procedural, the sound of a man delivering a death sentence dictated by regulations. The room's temperature seemed to drop. The unspoken truth hung in the air. Trident 4 was being written off. "There is one other asset," a quiet voice interjected from the intelligence console. It was Lieutenant Davies, a data analyst barely old enough to shave. All eyes swiveled to him. He visibly swallowed, intimidated by the sudden focus. "Sir, Major Rostova's F-35B. She's on the tarmac at FOB Dagger, armed for deep interdiction. She was rerouted here when her primary mission was scrubbed." Thorne's gaze was withering. One aircraft? A single F-35 against a fully integrated air defense system? In those mountains? With this weather front moving in? He gestured dismissively at the meteorological overlay, which showed a ceiling of thick clouds descending upon the range. "That isn't a mission. It's an execution. We don't send a billion-dollar asset on a suicide run based on a prayer." He pulled up the pilot's file on his personal datapad, his expression souring further. "Major Anya Rostova. Callsign, Valkyrie." He scrolled through the notes. A stellar record marred by repeated commendations for unconventional problem-solving and reprimands for deviating from established doctrine. She was a former test pilot, a maverick who flew more by feel than by the book. Thorne was a man who lived by the book. "Her profile is a poor fit for a coordinated support mission," he declared, closing the file and the conversation. "We will continue to monitor and explore doctrinal solutions." But in the cockpit of Lightning 07, parked in a hardened shelter at the far end of the flight line, Major Rostova was already ahead of them. She wasn't waiting for an order. She was listening to the rhythm of the battle through the encrypted data links feeding into her helmet-mounted display. The frantic chatter, the pregnant pauses, the sudden cessation of a friendly call sign. It was a language she understood better than words. Her gloved fingers danced over the glowing touchscreens, her movements fluid and economical. Pre-flight checks were complete. Systems were green. She was just waiting for the inevitable, desperate call that protocol-bound men like Thorne would only make when they had no other choice. The world could have its doctrines. She had the hum of a Pratt & Whitney F-135 engine waiting to answer a different kind of logic. The call, when it came, wasn't a direct order. It was a loophole, a carefully worded query from a flight controller who knew her reputation. "Valkyrie, be advised, we have a dynamic situation in Grid Square Zulu 9er. What is your current ordnance load and fuel status for a potential, non-standard CAS sortie?" Anya didn't waste a syllable. She keyed her comms once. A sharp click that was her version of yes. The canopy slid down, sealing her inside the belly of the beast. The world outside muted, replaced by the symphony of the cockpit. The low, resonant hum of the avionics, the soft hiss of the oxygen system, the gentle thrum of the auxiliary power unit. She felt the jet as an extension of her own body, its nervous system of fiber optics and hydraulic fluid connected to hers. Her gaze fell on a small, non-regulation patch stitched onto the inner sleeve of her flight suit, concealed from official view. It depicted a stylized peregrine falcon, its eye a single unblinking sapphire chip. It was the insignia of her old test pilot squadron, a band of engineers and daredevils who believed that the only true flight parameters were the ones you discovered at the edge of destruction. Men like Thorne saw flight as a science of predictable inputs and outputs. Anya knew it was an art, a violent, beautiful conversation between pilot, machine, and physics. She ran a gloved thumb over a specific spot on the right side of the main console. The polymer surface was worn smooth, a faint discoloration marking it from the hundreds of times her hand had gone there in moments of extreme pressure. It was a tactile anchor, a reminder of a near-fatal flat spin over the Mojave Desert where instinct, not training, had saved her. The memory didn't bring fear. It brought focus. The clearance came through, laced with official reluctance. Valkyrie, you are cleared for takeoff. Proceed to Zulu Niner. You are to provide reconnaissance and threat assessment only. Do not engage unless you are fired upon. This is a non-engagement sortie. Anya acknowledged with another click. The distinction was meaningless. In a place like the Serpent's Spine, being seen was the same as being fired upon. She engaged the lift fan, and the F-35B began to roar. This wasn't a graceful, rolling takeoff. It was a controlled explosion, a brute force defiance of gravity. Over 40,000 pounds of thrust hammered the reinforced concrete of the tarmac, and the jet leaped vertically into the bruised purple of the twilight sky. It hung there for a heartbeat, a predatory insect of composite and steel, before the rear nozzle vectored backward, catapulting her into the night. The transition from a hover to Mach speed was a physical shock, a kick in the chest that Anya welcomed. The aircraft shuddered, then stabilized, slicing through the increasingly turbulent air. Below, the arid plains gave way to the foothills of the Al-Qadir Range. The Serpent's Spine. The name was apartment. The mountains rose from the earth like the fossilized vertebrae of some colossal beast, their peaks sharp enough to tear the sky. The weather Thorne had worried about was a real and present danger. A thick, wet ceiling of clouds hung at 10,000 feet, forcing her to fly lower. The winds howled through the passes, a treacherous, invisible river that could snap a wing or drive a plane into a granite wall without a moment's warning. For most pilots, this was a nightmare scenario. For Anya, it was home. This terrain was her ally. The jagged peaks and deep canyons that scrambled ground-based radar were channels and corridors she could use for cover. The violent wind shear was a current she could ride. She descended, plunging the F-35 into the labyrinth. The world outside her canopy became a high-speed blur of rock and shadow. The Ground Proximity Warning System, GPWS, began to chirp, then scream its electronic panic. Terrain! Terrain! Pull up! Anya silenced it with a flick of a switch. The system was designed for doctrinal flight, for pilots who flew over mountains. She was flying through them. Her helmet-mounted display painted the world in ghostly green and white lines, overlaying infrared imagery and sensor data onto the physical reality outside. It allowed her to see the heat signatures of rocks, the cold streams in the canyon floors, and the hot, angry bloom of enemy machinery. She wasn't just flying an aircraft. She was wearing it. The F-35's distributed aperture system gave her a 360-degree view, as if the very skin of the jet were transparent. She could look down through her own feet and see the gorge rushing by hundreds of feet below. In the TOC, they saw only her icon, a single green chevron moving at an impossible speed through a red-saturated map. She's below the radar floor, Davies murmured, his eyes wide. Completely masked. Colonel Thorne stared, his jaw tight. She's also in a coffin corner. One wrong move, one updraft, and she'll be a smear on a rock wall. He refused to be impressed by recklessness. This was not procedure. This was chaos. But for Anya, it wasn't chaos. It was clarity. Every gust of wind, Every change in air pressure against the control surfaces, every flicker of data on her display was a piece of information. She processed it all not with conscious thought, but with a deep, ingrained instinct. She threaded the jet through a rock formation that looked no wider than her wingspan, the engine's roar echoing back at her, a visceral, deafening clap of thunder. She was a ghost in the machine, a whisper in the canyons, and she was getting close. The SEALs of Trident 4 were making their last stand in a shallow, crescent-shaped depression on a barren hillside. They had formed a tight perimeter around the wounded HVT, using boulders as their only cover. Above them, on a commanding ridge, a fortified DSHK heavy machine gun nest had them pinned. The gunner was patient, firing and disciplined, 5-round bursts that chipped away at their rock sanctuary and kicked up deadly sprays of stone shrapnel. They couldn't move, they couldn't retreat, and the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the heavy weapon was the sound of their dwindling time. Mustang, this is Trident 4 lead. The team leader, Lieutenant Commander Mason, grunted into his radio, his voice strained. Any update on that air support? That DSHK is chewing us to pieces. Trident 4, be advised, asset is inbound. The controller's voice crackled back, offering no timeline, no promises. Mason cursed under his breath. Inbound could mean anything. Suddenly, the air split apart. It wasn't the high-pitched whistle of a distant jet. It was a tearing, violent roar that seemed to come from the very rocks around them. For a fraction of a second, the angular, menacing shape of the F-35 materialized, rising vertically from a canyon behind the enemy ridge. It was a vision from hell, a metal specter climbing a ladder of its own fire. It seemed to hang there for an impossible moment, its weapon bay doors already open. There was no warning, no missile trail, no sound of an incoming shell. A single, dark shape detached from the aircraft. The F-35 was already gone, disappearing back below the ridgeline as if it had never been there. The entire event took less than 3 seconds. The SEALs flinched, bracing for impact. The 1,000-pound GBU-32 JDM fell in a perfect, silent arc. It didn't strike the top of the machine gun nest. It penetrated the rocky outcrop just beneath it. The resulting explosion was a contained, focused detonation. The entire ridge shuddered, and the fortified position, along with its crew, simply ceased to exist, vaporized in a cloud of dust and pulverized granite. Silence descended, broken only by the ringing in their ears and the soft patter of falling debris. The oppressive thump-thump-thump was gone. Mason slowly got to his feet, peering through his scope at the smoking crater where their biggest problem had been. He keyed his comm, his voice raspy with disbelief. TOC, who in the hell was that? Back in the command center, every operator was staring at the main screen. The icon for the DSHK nest had just blinked out of existence. Lieutenant Davies leaned into his microphone, a small, triumphant smile on his face. Trident 4, that's Valkyrie. She's on station. Colonel Thorne stood motionless, watching the replay from a satellite thermal feed. He saw the impossible vertical pop-up, the ordnance release, the immediate dive back into cover. It was a maneuver that wasn't in any training manual. It was brutally efficient, surgically precise, and suicidally dangerous. It was the move of a pilot who didn't just fly her aircraft, but danced with it. His skepticism hadn't vanished, but it was now laced with a grudging, unsettling flicker of awe. The enemy was not stupid. They had been arrogant, relying on the natural fortress of the mountains and their sophisticated jamming to protect them. The sudden, precise elimination of their overwatch position was a nasty shock. They had been hunting deer and had just discovered a wolf in the fold. Now they adapted. Deep within the valley, hidden beneath camouflage netting, the crews of 2 SA-15 Gauntlet mobile surface-to-air missile launchers scrambled into action. Their systems, previously passive, roared to life. Powerful search radars began to sweep the canyons, their electronic pulses slicing through the air, actively hunting for the ghost that had struck them. In Anya's cockpit, the world turned hostile. Her threat display, previously clear, lit up like a Christmas tree. 2 yellow circles appeared, representing the search radars, their sweeping lines painting the terrain around her. An urgent, high-pitched tone filled her helmet, the sound of being hunted. Search, search. Some. Valkyrie, be advised. The controller's voice crackled, now stripped of its earlier triumph and filled with urgency. Multiple new emitters active. SA-15s are online, bearing 070 and 155 from your position. They're trying to box you in. Copy, was her only reply. Her hands moved with practiced calm over the controls. She wasn't panicking. She was processing. The hunters had revealed themselves. She now knew their location, their type, their capabilities. The fear that would have paralyzed another pilot only sharpened her focus. The game had changed. In the TOC, Colonel Thorne stepped closer to the tactical plot. His arms no longer crossed. He was leaning forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the console. He was no longer a skeptical administrator. He was a mission commander. Get her the real-time telemetry from the rivet joint, he barked at a communications tech. I want her to see what that Sigint bird is seeing. Now, he was no longer giving her orders on engagement. He was giving her information, trusting her to use it. It was a subtle but profound shift. He was starting to believe. Anya saw the new data stream flood her display, a richer, more detailed picture of the electronic battlefield. She saw the lobes of the enemy radar coverage, the gaps between them, the blind spots created by the terrain. They thought they were building a cage. Anya saw a pathway. She pushed the throttle forward, accelerating deeper into the canyon system. This was counterintuitive. The logical move was to climb to try and outrun the threat. But Anya knew the gauntlet was a short to medium range system, deadliest to targets in the open sky. In the canyons, she was a nightmare for their targeting computers. The sheer clutter of rock and the tight turns made getting a clean missile lock nearly impossible. She's going deeper, Davies noted, a tremor in his voice. She's using the terrain as a shield, Thorne corrected, his eyes glued to the display. She's forcing them to move, to reposition for a better shot. And when they move, they're vulnerable. Down on the ground, Trident 4 was on the move, using the precious moments Valkyrie had bought them. They were heading for a secondary extraction point, a small, exposed plateau on the other side of a narrow pass. But enemy reinforcements were already swarming toward them, infantry crawling through the rocks, attempting to cut them off. Valkyrie, Trident needs a path cleared, the controller relayed. They have converging hostiles on their route to LZB. Anya banked the F-35 hard, the G-forces squeezing the breath from her lungs. A new series of targets appeared on her display, flagged by the SEAL's ground laser. They were enemy infantry too close to the friendlies for another bomb. This would require a different kind of precision, a more personal one. She armed the GU-22/A, the 25mm cannon nestled in her jet's left wing route. She descended even further into a gorge that ran parallel to the SEAL's path. The canyon walls were so close she could see the geological strata in the rock. Then, she pulled back on the stick, rocketing up and over the intervening ridge. For a few terrifying seconds she was exposed, a clear target. A new warning shrieked in her ears. Track, track. Sam, one of the gauntlets, had a partial lock. She ignored it. Time slowed. She saw the muzzle flashes of the enemy rifles below. She saw the green chemlight marking the SEAL's rearmost position. Her thumb pressed the firing stud on her control stick. The cannon erupted with a sound like a giant tearing a sheet of metal in half. The F-35 shuddered as the 25mm rounds, each the size of a beer bottle, ripped through the air at 4,000 feet per second. It wasn't a spray of bullets. It was a line drawn with surgical precision, a devastating scythe of depleted uranium that erased a dozen enemy soldiers from the mountainside. Before the echoes of the cannon fire had died, she was already diving back into the safety of the next canyon, the missile lock breaking as she once again vanished from the radar. The entire strafing run had lasted 5 seconds. It had been enough. The path for Trident 4 was clear. The SAM operators were furious. The Phantom jet had appeared, struck, and vanished before their system could achieve a solid firing solution. They had a lock for less than 2 seconds. Now they knew her game. She was using the canyons as trenches. The enemy commander made a decision. They would flush her out. The 2 gauntlet launchers began to move, coordinating their positions to cover the primary exits from the canyon network. High on the valley floor, the crew of a much larger, more powerful SA-11 gadfly system, dormant until now, activated their primary engagement radar. It was a trap. They would use the agile SA-15s to scare her out of the deep canyons and into the sky, where the long-range SA-11 was waiting to swat her down. Anya saw the trap unfolding on her tactical display. The geometry was clear. The mobile units were sealing the exits, while the big boy waited for her to break cover. Any conventional pilot would be forced to make a choice: climb into the kill box or stay in the canyons and run out of fuel. Anya chose a third option. "She's turning back into the network," Davies said, confused. "She's heading for the Serpent's Tooth, the narrowest section." "What is she doing?" someone muttered. Thorne didn't speak. He just watched, his mind racing through every possible maneuver, every doctrinal tactic. None of them fit. Rostova was off the map. Anya pushed the F-35's nose down, not up. She accelerated into a full-power dive, straight toward the floor of the deepest, most treacherous gorge in the entire range. The canyon, known as the Serpent's Tooth, was barely 200 feet wide at its base, a winding, vertical-walled scar in the earth. To fly into it at speed was considered utterly insane. The GPWS shrieked its final, desperate warnings before she silenced it for good. The world became a maelstrom of sound and pressure. The roar of her engine was trapped between the canyon walls, a continuous, deafening explosion that vibrated through the very bones of the aircraft. Proximity alerts for the left and right wingtips screamed a constant, high-pitched tone. The airframe groaned under the strain of the turbulent airflow. Outside the canopy, the rock walls were a solid, featureless blur, so close she felt she could reach out and touch them. Simultaneously, she engaged her most sophisticated piece of kit, the N/ASQ-239 electronic warfare suite. She instructed the system to perform a complex ghosting maneuver. It began broadcasting a powerful, spoofed signal, mimicking the radar signature of her F-35, but showing it climbing rapidly, as if she were making a desperate break for altitude from the canyon's northern exit. In the enemy command post, the trap had been sprung. "Target ascending! Target ascending!" their radar operator yelled. "She's breaking out of the canyon. Gadfly has a lock." The operators of the SA-11 system, confident their prey was finally in the open, acquired the ghost signal. "Solid lock. Firing solution confirmed. Engage!" the commander ordered. Miles away, a massive missile leaped from its launcher, roaring into the sky on a pillar of white smoke, climbing toward a piece of empty air where Valkyrie was not. While the entire enemy IADS was focused on the phantom in the sky, the real Valkyrie was screaming through the Serpent's Tooth just 200 feet above the rocky canyon floor. She was flying below their minimum engagement altitude, completely invisible, a predator using the hunter's own focus against them. The G-forces were immense as she followed the violent twists of the gorge, her body pressed deep into her ejection seat, her vision tunneling. This was flight at its most primal, a pure contest of nerve and reflex. She navigated not by sight, but by a visceral, three-dimensional awareness of the space around her, feeling the aircraft buck and shudder as she danced it between the unforgiving walls of stone. She emerged from the far end of the canyon like a bullet fired from a gun, low and impossibly fast, behind the positions of the now exposed SA-15 launchers. They were still focused on the northern sky, tracking the Phantom missile intercept. They never even saw her. "Valkyrie, be advised, Trident 4 is at the extraction zone, but they're taking heavy fire. The landing zone is too hot for the helicopter." The controller's voice cut through the roar. The SEALs were on the exposed plateau, a flat-topped rock formation that offered zero cover. Enemy infantry were swarming up the slopes from three sides. It was a last-stand situation. The extraction helicopter, a heavily armed MH-47G Chinook, was circling a mile away, unable to risk the final approach. "I see them," Anya said, her first words in almost 20 minutes. Her voice was calm, devoid of any strain. "Tell the Hello to get ready. I'm clearing a path." She had used her bombs. Her primary cannon ammunition was low. But she wasn't defenseless. Banking hard, she swooped in over the plateau, this time ignoring the infantry. She flew directly towards the ridgeline where the heaviest fire was originating. As she passed over the SEAL's position, she did something that made the battle-hardened operators on the ground freeze in sheer disbelief. She deployed her landing gear. The heavy, reinforced struts and wheels slammed down and locked into place at over 400 knots. An action the aircraft's internal system screamed was structurally catastrophic. The F-35 bucked violently, the aerodynamics thrown into chaos. It was an act of pure, calculated madness. But it had a purpose. Dropping the landing gear created massive drag, slowing her aircraft with brutal inefficiency. More importantly, it allowed her to fly at an impossibly high angle of attack. Her nose pointed steeply upwards while her flight path remained almost level. She became not a fighter jet, but a hovering, forward-firing weapons platform. This bizarre, unstable configuration allowed her to bring her 25mm cannon to bear on the enemy positions for a sustained period. She made a slow, deliberate pass along the ridgeline, the cannon chattering, spewing a torrent of high-explosive incendiary rounds. The concentrated fire was devastatingly effective, suppressing the enemy and forcing them to scramble for cover. She made 3 passes like this, a terrifying, gear-down gunship defying every known law of aerodynamics. On the ground, the SEALs just stared, mouths agape. They had seen incredible feats of airmanship before, but this was something else entirely. This was a pilot who was not just flying her jet, but breaking it, remaking it into the tool she needed it to be in that exact moment. On the 3rd pass, a missile streaked up from the valley floor, a lucky shot from a soldier with a shoulder-fired manpads. The F-35's automated defense systems flared, deploying a cloud of incandescent decoys. The missile, confused, detonated harmlessly 100 feet from her tail. But Anya didn't even flinch. Her focus was absolute. "LZ is green. I repeat, the LZ is green," Mason yelled into his radio. "Go! Go! Go!" The big Chinook, its pilots having witnessed the spectacle with the same stunned awe, didn't hesitate. It swooped in, its rotors kicking up a storm of dust and rock, and settled onto the plateau. As the last SEAL scrambled aboard with the HVT, Mason took one last look back. Valkyrie was circling high above, a silent guardian angel, her landing gear now retracted, her form once again sleek and deadly. In the noisy, vibrating belly of the Chinook, the SEALs were a study in controlled exhaustion. They were covered in grime, their gear scuffed, their faces etched with the grim lines of a mission that had gone sideways in every conceivable way. The youngest member of the team, a medic on his first combat deployment, stared out the open rear ramp at the receding mountains. I've never seen anything like that," he stammered, his voice barely audible over the rotor wash. "That flying. It wasn't possible." Lieutenant Commander Mason, reloading a fresh magazine into his rifle with steady, practiced hands, didn't look up. "That pilot," he said, his voice low and gravelly with respect, "is a damn legend." He keyed his helmet comm, switching to the air support frequency. "Valkyrie, this is Trident 4 lead. Words are insufficient. Trident 4 owes you a blood debt. We are clear of the AO." There was no verbal reply, just a moment of static, and then, high above them, the F-35 dipped its left wing in a slow, deliberate salute before banking sharply and accelerating into the darkening sky, a silver dart vanishing into the twilight. Back in the TOC, the tension had shattered, replaced by a stunned, electric silence. Every operator, every analyst, every officer had been glued to their monitors, watching the impossible unfold. They had witnessed a masterclass in aerial combat, a clinic in instinct and audacity that would be studied for decades. The green icon of the Chinook was now moving steadily away from the red-infested mountains. The mission was a success against all odds, against all logic, against all doctrine. Colonel Thorne stood alone in front of the main tactical display. The flight path Valkyrie had carved through the serpent's spine was still illuminated. A jagged, beautiful, terrifying line that defied every regulation he had ever committed to memory. It was the signature of an artist who painted with G-force and fire. He turned to his personal console and pulled up Major Anya Rostova's file one more time. He read the official assessments. Exceptional flight skills, displays a tendency to operate outside of accepted tactical parameters. Unconventional methods pose a risk to coordinated operations. He stared at the screen for a long moment, the words feeling hollow and meaningless after what he had just witnessed. His fingers moved over the keyboard. He accessed the Officer Evaluation Report section and opened a new entry. He typed slowly, deliberately, each keystroke a quiet admission of his own fallibility. Addendum to file, Colonel M. Thorne, commanding. Major Rostova's actions during Operation Serpent Spine were instrumental in the successful recovery of high-value assets and the preservation of SEAL Team Trident 4. Her unconventional methods proved to be the only viable solution in a non-permissive, dynamically hostile environment. Her instincts were validated under extreme pressure. She is not a risk. She is an asset of the highest strategic value. Asset indispensable. He saved the entry, closed the file, and shut down the terminal. The reversal was complete, not with a public proclamation, but with a quiet, permanent entry in a digital record. It was the only language the institution understood, and it was the highest form of respect he could offer. The F-35 be returned to FOB Dagger not with a scream, but a whisper. Instead of a long, conventional runway landing, it transitioned into a hover 100 feet above its designated landing pad. The vectored thrust from the engine created a shimmering curtain of heat distortion, the jet descending with an eerie, controlled grace. It settled onto the concrete with a gentle sigh of hydraulics, the brute power of its engine spooling down into an exhausted silence. For a full 5 minutes after the engine noise faded completely, there was no movement. The ground crew, who had raced out to meet the aircraft, kept their distance. They stood in a loose semicircle, their movements slow, their voices hushed. They were not just looking at a machine, they were looking at a warrior returning from battle. The aircraft itself seemed to be breathing, the superheated metal of its fuselage ticking and groaning as it cooled in the night air. They could see the battle scars, new pockmarks from small arms fire dotted the underside. A long black scorch mark marred the paneling near the cannon port, and a faint smell of ozone and burnt cordite hung in the air. Finally, the canopy hissed open, breaking the spell. The soft glow of the cockpit instrumentation cast Major Anya Rostova in silhouette. She sat motionless for another moment, her helmet still on, her head bowed slightly, as if in a private moment of communion with her machine. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving a profound, bone-deep weariness in its place. The storm of data, the screaming warnings, the crushing G-forces. It all faded, leaving only the quiet hum of the cooling avionics. She unstrapped herself with methodical, unhurried movements and removed her helmet. The cool desert air felt like a balm on her face. She swung her legs over the side of the cockpit and climbed down the integrated ladder, her boots touching the ground with a soft thud. The crew chief approached, holding a maintenance log, but he stopped a few feet away. He simply looked at her, then at the scarred aircraft, and gave a slow, respectful nod. No words were needed. The entire flight line understood. Anya met his gaze and gave a faint nod in return. She turned and walked away from the cooling fighter, her shadow long in the harsh floodlights of the tarmac. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The silence that followed her was louder than any medal, fuller than any praise. It was the sound of earned respect, absolute and unspoken.